Hi, I'm Michelle Stirling for Friends of Science Society. At the end of January, a number of preliminary reports provided to the Alberta Inquiry into the anti-Albertan activity became a topic of interest in the press. The most astounding were two reports by Dr. Tammy, Nemeth, historian, who provided the grand scope of global activity pushing a transnational progressive movement. The reaction from a few fronts was lamentable and predictable. Martin Olszynski, associate professor of law at the University of Calgary, called the reports textbook climate denialism. The Canadian Association of Journalists was outraged that journos and the media had been identified as being an integral part of this global propaganda campaign. They issued a huffy statement: journalists have a moral obligation to clearly inform the public of any catastrophic threat, whether it's the coronavirus or climate change, said CAJ President Brent Jolly. Reporting on climate change should not be seen as an act of advocacy. It is the telling of a very real truth that is unequivocally backed up by scientific facts. And Josh Thomas of the Spruce Grove Examiner wrote that the reports were a divisive waste of taxpayer dollars, defending the media throughout his response. Well, it so happens that I had written a commentary on these matters, which was posted on the Friends of Science blog, and I posted the link on a blog called Blazing Cat Fur. Sometime thereafter, Dr. Tammy Nemeth, author of two of the Alberta Inquiry reports in question, saw it there and contacted me, directing me to her rebuttal to the Josh Thomas editorial. Since I felt her rebuttal might just be buried or forgotten by the news cycle, I asked her permission to read it on camera to get wider coverage, and she agreed. So here's what Dr. Tammy Nemeth wrote to Josh Thomas, editor of the Spruce Grove Examiner and supporter of the position of the Canadian Association of Journalists. Dr. Nemeth writes, "It is interesting that the recent editorial by Josh Thomas chose to focus on a small 7-page segment in a report and supplement of 229 pages and 465 footnotes. To call the report and its supplement bordering on propaganda because it questions not only the attacks on Alberta's energy industry, but also the trajectory of our country, is not a misinterpretation. It is flat out wrong. My reports," Dr. Nemeth writes, "offer a bigger picture of the attacks that have been mounted against Alberta's energy industry, situating them within the global context. They pull together various trends and activities that document a transnational progressive movement that has diverse fellow travelers in Canada and abroad, including elements in the media, working towards a reset of the entire global economic and political system. The transformation or reset, with climate change at its heart, is predicated on the eventual destruction of the petroleum industry in Alberta and Western countries. Indeed, the venerable Time magazine ran a cover story in October 2020 about the Great Reset, not as a conspiracy theory, but as a vision for the future. The reports document this transnational progressive movement, the environmental movement to keep it in the ground, the push to divest from petroleum companies, the changes proposed to green the financial industry, the institutes and think tanks that provide the intellectual capital for these actions, the business groups who support it, the international institutions involved, the organizations that allow the different players to assemble and cooperate, and the foundations that have funneled a staggering amount of money to make this transformation happen. Some have just concluded meeting virtually in Davos to discuss how to bring about this global change. The reports by Dr. Nemeth also examine interconnections between the Build Back Better motif, the various Green New Deals being implemented in other jurisdictions, and the initiatives proposed by the Trudeau government that amount to a Green New Deal in Canada. The reports quote and reference what people have actually said. For example, economist Mariana Mazzucato, in a September Project Syndicate article, stated quite clearly, in the near future, the world may need to resort to lockdowns again, this time to tackle a climate emergency. Under a climate lockdown, governments would limit private vehicle use, ban consumption of red meat, and impose extreme energy-saving measures, while fossil fuel companies would have to stop drilling. To avoid such a scenario, we must overhaul our economic structures to do capitalism differently. She's not alone in that viewpoint. That's a vision of the future that ought to make every Albertan question where this is all going. And as for the media, Dr. Nemeth writes, my research briefly discusses Covering Climate Now and other news facilitators that, among other things, provide quick information for busy journalists on climate issues. From their website, all partners are committed to increasing the volume and quality of our profession's coverage of the climate story. And sometimes they even do an ask. Chris White in the Daily Caller reported in April 2020 that the founders behind Covering Climate Now are asking their network of more than 400 media outlets to blanket the airwaves with stories about climate change during the week of Earth Day, 19th to 26th of April 2020. That did happen, and perhaps helps to explain the surge in silver lining stories and other op-eds on using a recovery package to facilitate a green recovery. Dr. Nemeth writes, as I say in the report, more organizations not only allow the message to be spread more broadly, it also helps to protect and insulate journalists if criticism arises. Indeed, the current response to the reports seems to prove that point. The media should encourage Canadians to have an honest conversation about how these proposed changes will affect our very way of life, not shout down and dismiss those who call it into question. Dr. Nemeth closes her rebuttal by saying, I encourage people to read the report and its supplement so that the full context can be appreciated. So, it's interesting to me how quickly this story died. Out of a more than 200-page report, there was nothing else to write about? Are there no journalists interested in our economy and jobs? The Alberta oil sands developers projected a growth of employment from 75,000 jobs in 2010 to 905,000 jobs in 2035, almost 1 million jobs. They projected the generation of $2.1 trillion in economic stimulus over the next 25 years from 2010 to 2035. They projected development that would have contributed $105 billion to provincial taxes and over $311 billion in federal taxes, and the collection of over $350 billion in royalties from 2010 to 2035. These economic benefits would have been spread across Canada, but the tar sands campaign destroyed those jobs and economic benefits. It seems to me that the Canadian Association of Journalists is too busy advocating for climate change instead of actually doing investigative reports on it, or on the parties that push the climate catastrophe narrative as an agenda to enact this green trade war against Alberta. It seems these journalists have hurt feelings over Dr. Nemeth's well-researched reports, while we have a decimated economy, over 100,000 jobless, and thousands of lives in ruins. Hopefully the public, you viewers, will read Dr. Nemeth's reports. Climate change is real, but we reached peak carbon in 2019, according to research by Roger Pielke Jr. Climate catastrophe claims are based on outdated science, and enough dirty lies about the oil sands carbon intensity. Why are there no headlines about that? For Friends of Science Society, I'm Michelle Stirling.